Good afternoon, everyone. As John has very nicely introduced, food addiction is currently a very excitable topic, has generated lots of heat. The question is whether headlines like this, brief descriptions like this, actually generate any light on the subject of overeating and obesity. And the brief that I've been given, or given myself, is to look at some of the evidence on food addiction. And I'll be taking a little bit closer look, following on from John, at some of the animal experiments and some studies with human beings that bear on this issue. But really what I want to, and I'm interested in looking at, is whether this concept of food addiction is helpful in explaining overeating in a general scientific sense, and also at a personal level. Or is it helpful to individuals to believe in food addiction in relation to their own control and gaining control of behavior? So really, I think to start a topic like this, we need to look at what addiction is. And, well, it's a word. It's a word that we use in everyday discourse. The key aspects of it being excessiveness, doing something to excess more than is generally the case. And there's also an element of having difficulty in stopping, and harmful effects of the habit, of the activity. But it's use is not just confined, as John said, not just confined to taking drugs, psychoactive drugs, but more generally to refer to everyday activities. So someone who says they're a soap opera addict is probably saying they spend more time than they would like watching soap operas. They're indicating that this is probably too much TV watching for their own good. And they would like to perhaps cut down, but it might be distressing to do so. And similarly, if I say I'm a chocoholic, I'm probably indicating to you that I eat quite a lot of chocolate, and I would like to eat less, but it may be difficult to cut down. To some extent, whether or not my behavior meets the clinical criteria for addiction, I think it's interesting in trying to understand why someone would label themselves as a chocoholic, what their experiences are in relation to that food. I think it conveys important information about one's relationship with the food. Here is an authoritative scientific definition of addiction. Pretty much matches the dictionary definition. Though here it's reserved for a rather extreme state, and a very important element is this a loss of control. I think to some extent you can see that both these criteria involve some subjectivity, in that they will depend on self-reports of the individual, or some decision about what is an extreme state, what is a loss of control. And that's even more the case with craving. As John mentioned, craving is often a feature or an aspect of the food addiction debate. And essentially, craving is a private experience. It's as defined in most studies, in the dictionary as well. It's a state of having a desire for a specific substance, or to do a specific activity. But I can only tell that from asking you about your craving. It's hard for me to get a sense of an objective. I depend on your verbal description of your experience. It's also worth noting here that dependence is defined independently of addiction. And indeed, dependence can almost certainly occur I've got an example in my next slide. Dependence can occur independent of addiction. Also, it's at the same time, it's easier, I think, to actually demonstrate dependence. And actually, because of time, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but just to say, if you're a frequent caffeine consumer, you are dependent on caffeine, because if you don't haven't consumed caffeine recently, you will function below your normal level. You will be sleepy and you will think more slowly. And if you take some caffeine, you get back to your normal level of performance, but not above it, or down to a normal level of sleepiness. So that's dependence objectively defined. But I would argue that actually rather few people are addicted in the sense that there doesn't seem to be a loss of control towards drinking tea and coffee. Most people could actually stop consuming caffeine rather easily. And indeed, in many studies, we've asked people to give up, and they don't find it difficult. So that's dependence and addiction are importantly separate entities, although dependence often accompanies. So what is the case for food addiction? So John has already mentioned hyperpalatability. So that is part of the argument that certain foods, perhaps virtually all foods, have share features with addictive drugs in terms of their effects on behavior and brain. And I've chosen actually similar examples, similar papers to John to illustrate this. Oh dear, sorry about that. And here is some details of one of these studies. And I'm going to just take a minute perhaps to describe this in some detail. There are two groups of rats here. One has, as John described, continuous access to a sugar solution, a 10% sugar solution. So that could be equated with a cola drink, the same concentration of sucrose as in cola or other sodas. And the rats also have their usual diet available as well. Another group of rats is given intermittent access to the sugar solution. So 4 hours into their dark cycle, that's when the rats are most active and they consume most of their food, they get access to the sugar solution for 12 hours in total. And the key observation here is that over time, after 21 days, these rats who are given intermittent access consume a relatively large meal, in inverted commas, of this sucrose solution when the solution is made available. And the authors describe this as a binge. And then on day 22, the rats are not given access to this sucrose, and instead subjected to a variety of tests. And those tests, as John suggested, show the rats demonstrate distress, both behaviorally and in terms of physiological effects. But I think another way of looking at this sort of phenomenon, this sort of behavior, is that it's not addictive behavior. It's not at all surprising, perhaps, that these rats learn about the schedule of access that they get to this good-tasting solution and come to anticipate this meal, anticipate this access by drinking a reasonably large amount, and then they get distressed if on one occasion, unexpectedly, they don't get the access, or the sugar's not made available. And actually, this meal turns out to be a very small amount of sugar, even for a rat. I calculate about a 20th of its daily calorie intake. The other important thing here to note is that this intermittent access to this sugar solution doesn't promote an overall increase in energy intake or body weight in these. There is indeed a much better model of overeating and obesity than that, which is giving animals continuous access to energy-rich foods. So in this study, the rats were given access to foods such as fat, bread, chocolate, and peanuts in this case. At this point here, the animals overeat avidly at the start, and they gain weight, actually body fat, rapidly. And I would argue that that is a pretty good model of perhaps elements of the cause of human obesity. When I did this work, I interpreted this in terms of the palatability, or if I thought of it, perhaps the hyperpalatability of these foods. But in retrospect, I realized that actually this really doesn't tell us very much, unless, as John suggested, what do we mean by hyperpalatability? What causes hyperpalatability? In fact, what I think causes this overeating is the energy density of these foods. And we have good evidence from a variety of human studies that energy density is a key factor in causing increased energy intake. So here is a fairly heroic experiment, in fact. The results look pretty simple. But in this study over a 5-day period, participants were fed diets of different energy densities by manipulation of fat in the diet. But the key thing is that researchers kept as far as possible the taste of those foods and the appearance of those foods identical. The more energy dense foods were associated with higher energy intake. It's also the case that these people appear to choose higher energy dense foods. So again, evidence that energy density plays a role in promoting increased consumption. One of the key observations in this study, though, is that as body weight increases here, or body fatness increases, you can see that there's a decrease in food intake over time, so that the rate of body weight increase slows down and reaches a plateau parallel with the rats on the control diet. And I would argue that this reflects an adaptive response to getting fatter. As we get fatter, actually, the rewarding effects of food decline, and that makes sense biologically. With increased energy stores, we should be less interested in taking on more food, and that's exactly how the system seems to work. These rats eat less as they get fatter. So that would suggest that the decrease in reward value of food that John alluded to in at least one theory of food addiction, one hypothesis, is actually an adaptive response of the biological system and not a pathological response. And that's supported by these data. And again, I'm not going to look at these in too much detail, but what we have here is evidence from some elaborate animal experiments that have been used to support the notion that foods can cause addictive behavior like addictive drugs. What we have here is a measure of the rewarding effects of electrical brain stimulation. So the rats here have electrodes implanted into reward areas of the brain that serve reward and control motivated behavior. And the measure here is the current threshold at which they will work to stimulate their own brains to get that reward. And the results show that with exposure to addictive drugs and the exposure to energy-dense foods, cafeteria foods, chocolate, cheesecake, I think, was in this study, and other such foods, the reward value of electrical brain stimulation decreases. The current threshold increases. So there's a parallel. Where that parallel breaks down is when the drugs and the foods are withdrawn. So the reward value of electrical brain stimulation returns to normal levels quite rapidly after drugs are withdrawn, but not after food. And this suggests to me that this effect of food is not linked to the food itself, but to the obesity that's caused by overeating in these, by these foods in these rats. So here, obesity is only declining slowly, and that's why reward value is still lowered. So that fits very nicely, I think, with these data here. This negative feedback effect of appetite, body fat on appetite. Okay, so a quick summary of evidence from animal models. I would question, like John, the relevance of many of these intermittent access models to human eating patterns. I think often in these papers, there's an issue of use of language. So what looks like actually adaptive behavior is described as a binge, for example. And I would argue that actually talking about palatability or hyperpalatability doesn't really explain much on its own. We need to identify the features of diets that cause overeating. Energy densities would seem to be one, and the mechanism for that is probably the lower satiating value, calorie per calorie, of energy-dense foods. And lastly, I would say actually what's often called reward dysfunction, in fact, is an adaptive response, as I've just tried to identify. And indeed, the same argument has been made, again, as John has suggested, in relation to human studies, evidence that from brain imaging studies, that there's underfunctioning of the reward system in obesity. Again, I would suggest that that, in fact, is an adaptive response in humans as well as rats. I also now want to take a little bit of time to talk about craving. So the argument here would be that although a craving often accompanies addiction, it doesn't imply that addiction exists. So we actually looked at this some time ago and thought and concluded that craving really is an expression of normal appetite, normal mechanisms of appetite control. And our model is this one. What we were interested in is explaining craving for chocolate. So purportedly, chocolate is the most widely craved food, at least in UK and US samples. And in a nutshell, our argument is that craving arises because we often try and resist our appetite for this food. An important idea here is that the desires we get to eat specific foods is just an expression of normal appetite. That's aroused by being in the context or having internal feelings that have been previously paired with consumption of that food. It gives rise to that desire to eat. So to give you an example, if I walk into my kitchen in the morning, I will get a desire to eat toast and marmalade because that's what I normally do. Now, I wouldn't typically label that as a craving, although it is an experience of a rather specific desire to eat. Although I might just, in some studies, if the studies ask me to rate my experience, which is a strong or specific desire to eat a particular food, perhaps that is a craving. It may become more likely to be a craving if the toaster's broken and I can't have my toast and marmalade. So rather than the desire to eat toast and marmalade going away, it's likely that I'll ruminate on that, think about it, elaborate about that. And that experience I might be inclined to label as a craving. That would be even more so, perhaps, if this food was chocolate. And we argue that people quite often try and resist their desire to eat chocolate, this normal appetite for chocolate, because they're rather ambivalent about eating this food, because we have the attitude that chocolate is unhealthy, potentially fattening, and so on. This is a treat, it's not a staple food. We may also perhaps try to resist it because we anticipate regretting eating it, having consumed what some of us would regard as indulgent and unhealthy. But it's that resistance that causes the experience of craving. And in turn, that's reinforced by the idea, the widely held view, that actually chocolate might be addictive. So we have a phrase for that, alcoholism. And so therefore craving links with the idea of addiction, and being addicted suggests that my difficulty with chocolate is because of something inherent in the food. It blames the food rather than something in myself, my weak will, for example. So we're inclined to make these attributions of addiction to describe our own behavior and explain our behavior to other people. And John Booth Davis has written very cogently and persuasively on this subject. And he, in particular, argues that attributions, or talks about how attributions serve a particular function of explaining behavior, but also how these attributions undermine self-efficacy, self-control, and are counterproductive to changing behavior, changing towards more healthy behavior. Now, there's actually rather little direct evidence on this subject, but I've tried to put together one or two thoughts about this here, which go along the following lines. I see John's getting up, so I probably need to stop fairly soon, so I won't go through these in detail. But for example, one study done some over 20 years ago by Jane Ogden and Jane Wardle on dieters, what they found is that dieters who attribute dietary lapses to a failure of self-control are more likely to break their diets than people who attribute their failure to external events. So, for example, if I attribute my dietary lapse to the fact that I find it impossible to resist eating cake, rather than, well, I ate some cake because I was celebrating my partner's birthday, that attribution about internal lengths, self-efficacy, is more likely to undermine my ability to keep on that diet and lose weight. And that's very much what the attribution of addiction does, is make me think the food is irresistible in some ways. I lack the ability to control my behavior, my impulses towards that. What we're currently trying to do with some colleagues in Liverpool is see to the extent to which priming the idea of addiction either helps or doesn't help people control their eating behavior towards potentially addictive, so-called addictive foods, And the preliminary results suggest that, if anything, the balance is that the notion of food addiction leads to increased food intake and lack of and a diminished self-efficacy. So the very last theme here is to look at the last piece, the last aspect of evidence for food addiction. So I've left this until last. And the bottom line here is that perhaps binge eating, as described here, indeed does look something like food addiction. It involves excessive consumption in short periods of time and, importantly, this feeling of lack of control. But whether or not this is food addiction very much depends on how you define food addiction. So if you define that more stringently, in criteria like these are criteria that are adapted from criteria for defining addiction to drugs, then even individuals who are diagnosed with binge eating disorder, less than half of those actually, according to these criteria, are food addicted. And of course, there's a question of the extent to which binge eating actually contributes to overconsumption and obesity. Now, it is the case that there's a higher incidence or prevalence of obesity in people who have binge eating disorder. But actually, the prevalence of binge eating disorder in the community is much lower than the prevalence of obesity. So while binge eating may be a feature of obesity, it's not a feature of obesity in most people. John mentioned the Yale Food Addiction Scale. What you can see here is on that scale, the majority of people who are obese people who are identified are not food addicts, identified by that scale. Only about a third are. The question I would ask here is the extent to which binge eating contributes to overeating and obesity. What proportion of daily energy intake comes in binges, for example? And as far as I'm aware, we actually don't know that currently. It may be that binges, some of which look like food addiction perhaps, are compensated by other healthy activity, by eating less in other meals or increased physical activity. So, to summarize, I would say that the evidence from a variety of studies suggests that attributing overeating to addiction is understandable. It's understandable in terms of our drive to explain our own and others' aberrant and unhealthy behavior. But on balance, the notion of food addiction is probably unhelpful personally in helping us, assisting us reducing overeating. And so my overall conclusion is that we should be looking elsewhere in our efforts to understand overeating and indeed treating overeating.